Hello, everybody. My name is Shaughnessy Clemens, and this is,
Laura Cirillo.
and we are the co-founders of the Coalition for Equity in Anthropology. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel with Drs. Elizabeth DiGangi and Jonathan Bethard.
Part of our mission as CEA co-founders and members is to open up discussions on important topics within anthropology to the general public. So we hope that you will engage with us on our multiple social media levels and continue this discussion within your own social spheres. In order to facilitate that discussion, I will link below our contact information as well as the articles that we are going to be discussing today. If you have not yet read them, I encourage you to do so before continuing the video. And I will also list citations for any relevant contextual information mentioned today so that you can stay involved without getting lost in any details of something you might not be familiar with.
Okay, so a panelist joining us today is Elizabeth DiGangi, and Elizabeth DiGangi holds a bachelor's and master's from University at Buffalo and a PhD from the University of Tennessee. She was instrumental in the creation of the Centro de Identificación Humana in Medellin, a state-of-the-art forensic anthropology center for the identification of human remains, continuing education, and research. She is co-editor of Research Methods in Human Skeletal Biology and co-author of Forensic Taphonomy and Ecology of North American Scavengers. Her research interests range from gunshot trauma analysis to ancestry and social race, and she is currently an associate professor at Binghamton University. Our other panelist is Jonathan Bethard, and Jonathan holds his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the University of Tennessee. He worked as an instructor for numerous courses in forensic anthropology with the International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program in Colombia and Algeria, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross in Tbilisi, Georgia. His current research focuses on the intersectionality of biological anthropology and archaeology through application of diverse bioarchaeological questions. He has an active bioarchaeological research program in Transylvania that focuses on understanding medieval Hungarian communities in joint effort with local anthropologists. And he is currently an assistant professor at University of South Florida. Both are board certified forensic anthropologists. And if you're a student listening, it's beneficial to know that they are both at institutions with undergraduate, master's, and doctoral programs and are eligible to advise students. Thanks so much for joining us. Hello.
Yeah, hi, Sean and Laura. It's great to be here and to join the whole community of people who will be watching and listening. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Laura and Sean and the CEA for the invitation to be here today.
So we'll start it off with our first question, which is, what inspired you to come together to write about this topic in the first place?
So I'll start by saying that my thoughts on the subject of ancestry estimation and forensic anthropology have really evolved over my time as a undergraduate student, graduate student, and professional. And I probably started thinking the most about this topic during the process for studying for the board exam via the American Board of Forensic Anthropology, in part because took me 2 times to pass that exam, which meant that I had 2 opportunities to basically do a comprehensive review of the literature. So for about 2 years, I dedicated a big chunk of my professional efforts to reading and thinking about the literature of forensic anthropology and on the subject of ancestry estimation because of the necessity of what would be required in the examination process for board certification. And it's probably during that time that in thinking and reading through the literature specific to forensic anthropology, I began to puzzle over some of the similarities, but some of the key differences in what forensic anthropologists do and how they do it, and what bioarchaeologists do and how they do it in terms of sheer methodology and when it comes to the analysis of human skeletal remains. And I just began to really think specifically about the history of the field, how the history of the field influences current practices. And then, you know, as what has been demonstrated much before, but was really put forward into sort of public consciousness in 2020, thinking about how forensic anthropology fits into the bigger picture of the criminal justice system, the medical legal system, and the process of human identification. And it was after the events of the summer of 2020, which was well into the pandemic, when, you know, tens of thousands of people had died, when it was obvious that the pandemic was affecting communities of color in greater numbers than white communities in the United States, as well as the highly publicized invisible murder of Black Americans that were, you know, on television for all of us to see, as well as the subsequent protests for racial justice that occurred, that inspired me back in the summer. I just thought, like, I've got to try to articulate what I'm thinking and what I'm seeing and the connections that I'm drawing in my mind. And that's what led me to just sort of sit down and start to write what I was thinking. And it was, you know, a several day period where I just sort of locked myself in my office, read and wrote and thought. And then at some point said to Liz, you know, after many different kinds of conversations, like, let's talk about what I'm writing and I'd love your input. And I think that was probably how the really sort of the spark for the piece that got a lot of this conversation going.
Yeah, so, you know, as Dr. Bethard just said, he had already told me, you know, I'm going to be writing this, and we had talked a lot about it over the course of the summer. And then at one point he said, you know, do you want to be a co-author? And I said, absolutely, you know, I'd love to. And so in terms of my own sort of journey, I guess, with ancestry estimation, I have always been interested in issues of surrounding race and racism and structural violence, structural you know, systems in place that reinforce racism from the time that I was a kid, and in large part because of my own particular identity of being Black and white, of growing up with a white father and a Black mother, and then later a white stepfather and, you know, a Black mother, and just what that meant for me as a kid in a very diverse city, but as being, you know, myself and my brother in our school, where whites certainly were the minority, but we were probably the only, you know, white and Black kids in the entire school. So we didn't really fit in. You know, people thought we were Hispanic or Arabic. We didn't really fit, right? At least for me, you know, I don't want to speak to my brother's experience, but in terms of my experience, didn't really feel like I fit in just about anywhere. And the city that I grew up in was highly segregated. It still is to this day. And my mother was involved with desegregation efforts. She was one of the city officers in charge of, there's a federal lawsuit to desegregate the Yonkers City schools. And she was working for this Yonkers, New York. And she was working for the city. And one of her jobs was to sort of be in charge of the part of the implementation of that for the city manager's office. And so, you know, growing up, I would, you know, being in the car and would see, you know, epithets graffitied against the federal judge in that case, who said, guess what, guys, you've got to desegregate the schools. You have to have busing. And obviously people in the super, you know, rich part, white part of town were really upset about that. And I could talk more about that. I know that's not what we're here for today, but so I've always been interested in just these kinds of issues. When I was 14 or 13, I won a citywide contest on writing an essay about about racism and how, you know, people of different races should get along, right? And actually, I just recently found that my Christmas break task was to go through all my old storage, and I came across it. And it was interesting to see how my thinking had evolved, but also to see how, you know, the fact that these are kinds of themes that I've been interested in for a really long time. And I've always been disturbed by, okay, so we're saying that, you know, biological race doesn't exist. And there's this very problematic history of the creation of race, and physical anthropology is the one that created, is the discipline really. Certainly it began with naturalists before physical anthropology, but physical anthropology is really the discipline that created and sort of legitimized biological race, right? And so I've always been really disturbed by that juxtaposition between anthropology creating it, then anthropology saying it doesn't exist, then anthropology also saying, but at the same time, we can measure the skull, we can look at these traits on the skull. And I wrote a book chapter in 2013 where at that time, it's also been interesting to reread that chapter and to see how my thinking has evolved. But even at that time, I think you can tell if you kind of read between the lines that I was struggling with it, although I wasn't at the point that I'm at now where I was, you know, able to say, no, we should, it's simple, we should not be doing this anymore. But so for a long time, I've just been struggling with why are we doing this, right? What value are we really adding? And as you can see from these, you know, pieces that we have just written, you know, it's my opinion and it's Dr. Bethard's opinion that in fact we are doing harm by doing these practices. And so that's kind of how that first piece really came about. That's the full contextual background for you.
I really appreciated that you guys both touched on the evolution of your thinking and thought process from the beginning of your involvement in anthropology to now. I think that's really important that you highlighted the fact that ideas have changed and evolved over time.
Yeah, I'll just speak to that for a moment as well, because particularly for students that are watching this, you know, students are in a position where you're learning, and you're learning the basics, particularly in something that is highly technical like forensic anthropology. And I think that for many reasons, there's been an emphasis on the techniques and the methodologies of forensic anthropology, which are obviously important and are required through various kinds of Supreme Court cases. If students don't know, you should look up something called the Daubert Trilogy and read a little bit about that. So I think that forensic anthropologists have focused on technical things, and we've certainly been somewhat privy to debates about ancestry and forensic anthropology because they're not new, right? People have been questioning them for a long time, but it's still been really entrenched that the biological profile has 4 components. And so you must be able to know and be competent about providing information about those 4 components. And so I think when you're a graduate student, that's what you aspire to do. You aspire to do what you hear your professors say. You aspire to do what the very influential leaders of the field that you see at conferences. You want to know what they know and do what they do. And it's probably, I mean, certainly in my case, after the PhD, working in the university environment, sort of reflecting on myself, is when I started to really recognize it was okay to sort of change and really reimagine how I see myself in the field and what I want to do in it.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that that's important for students to recognize that, you know, there is a process to just being an intellectual, right? And that it's okay to grow. I mean, there's a process to being a human being, right? We should be embracing growth and change, and those things obviously are difficult for a variety of different reasons. But I'm happy that, and I'm proud of myself that I've gotten to a point in my career where I'm embracing that discomfort at saying, okay, I don't think this anymore, or, you know, I want to be able to say something about this. Is that okay? And yes, you know, that is okay. That's part of the process.
So let's jump into that first JFS letter to the editor piece, because that's really what started this whole conversation around your work. In that piece, you outlined two primary points. First, a moratorium on the use of morphoscopic traits, and then a call to action to investigate how ancestry estimation might be harmful to forensic identification. So I sort of wanted to break down those 2 points a little bit and dig a little deeper. So first, can you describe how you've seen morphoscopic traits used in ancestry estimation so far, and why you suggested a moratorium in the first place?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and it goes back to my previous answer of, again, really having the opportunity over a 2-year period to thoughtfully read and think about the literature related to this particular topic of morphoscopic traits, particularly juxtaposed to the other areas of my work that involve bioarchaeology and the analyses that, for example, bioarchaeologists do in biological distance. And I think it sort of has been puzzling me about morphoscopic traits and their use in the field and how they developed. And it's well established that they were originally sort of pioneered and codified by Hooton, and in fact, in a list that's referred to as the Harvard list, and many folks have written about this. And it was the fact that these traits at the time of Hooton, who was a physical anthropologist that looked at the fixity of human groups and thought, well, I see these traits in these particular populations, which correspond with geography and social racial categories that we use in the US, and how that sort of fundamental early idea was picked up by forensic anthropologists and then continued to be utilized. And we know that literature, we know the book length treatments that sort of established as a really important methodology the trait list approach. We know how that's been debunked in a way, and we know that what the modern approaches are that have been published, over the last 10 years, maybe a little bit more, really beginning in about 2009. And it is sort of the realization that I've made that these traits that we see, the one that I use, and folks who I've talked to this about, my one I use as the example is the post-pragmatic depression, right? And we know that this trait, which is observable, and we can look at other works to see its history, is either there or it's not, right? But okay, it's either there or it's not there. And I have just wondered, well, why? Why do people have one? Why does anyone have one? What is this trait? And until I know what it is, until I can look at it in comparison to the non-metric traits that have been studied with regard to heritability and pedigree, where we can actually say something about genetics, because ultimately ancestry is this interesting sort of amalgam of biology, culture, social labels, because that's ultimately what's being reported in a forensic anthropology report. It just seems problematic to me that we've got a list of traits that we're supposed to use in a framework, but we don't really know about. I can't explain to my students, I can't explain to myself why this particular cranium has a post-pragmatic depression and this one doesn't. And that's just not good enough, right? It's not good enough to not have an answer. And until I know the answer, until all of us know the answer, is why I made that strong statement to stop using it. Also in part because of the ways, even the modern approaches, the way in which the traits are used in combination did not seem to me to adequately reflect the structured population or the groups in the United States, let alone internationally. Both Dr. DiGangi and I have had the good fortune to work in forensic anthropology outside of the United States. And I think some of our thinking has been informed in places where ancestry is not part of the biological profile at all, or where it's a completely different history from what we recognize in the United States. And I sort of realized, well, if I can't go take these methodologies and apply them somewhere else, or if I applied them somewhere else, knowing what we know, but then got a completely different answer. The example that I like to use is working in Algeria. The two populations that people identify as are either Berber or non-Berber, right? Or Berber or Arab. And if I were to take those morphoscopic traits and apply them, who knows what I'm going to get? But I know that it's not going to relate at all to whatever that categorization is. And so not understanding them in terms of why they exist or when they develop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, seem to be the moment, the Summers letter was the moment where I said, this is not sufficient in terms of what we should be doing regarding the practice of human identification.
So the way I understand the term moratorium is that it's a temporary pause on the use of those traits until certain criteria are met. Do you still stand by the idea that you are looking for a moratorium, or are you looking for something more permanently dismissing these traits?
It's a great question, because I think I recognized at the time using that word at all, telling your colleagues to stop doing something even for a minute is pretty brazen, right? To say, I think about this in such a way that I think you should all stop. Myself, I'm telling myself to stop too. That certainly in the moment, the idea was, let's put the brakes on this. And I think in order to get to sort of the permanency question of what I mean by this, I think ultimately that answer is answered by our follow-up piece, when we fundamentally recognize, regardless of the intentions of ancestry, regardless of what heritabilities are, regardless of metric, non-metric, dental, bone, at some point, it all has to stop permanently because of fundamentally the thorniness and the problematic way of ancestry lending some voice to biological race and as a concept. And so I think that, yeah, to answer the question, I think that as we dive into the other part of the editorial, that the question of the permanency of a moratorium is answered by thinking at the big picture of what the entire endeavor is all about.
Yeah, emphasis on the lack to be harmful, the lack of intentionally to be intentionally harmful doesn't make something less harmful, is really what I drew from that response. And I appreciate it, because I do think many people need to hear that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Sean. I mean, and this is, as scientists, what we need to be thinking about. So not only, and I think we said this in the editorial, not only can we do it, but should we do it, right? Human cloning is possible. Should we be doing that, right? Maybe bringing, some dinosaur, or some mammoth or whatever back to life is possible. Is that a good idea, right? Yes or no? There are ethical considerations that we really need to take into account. And I think in forensic anthropology, largely, we have not done that with any, not only with this issue, but with others as well.
The mention of the anthropologist's ethical obligation in that editorial also comes up in that call to action section. So what were your expectations of the forensic community when you issued that call to action? And I know personally that a lot of the responses I've heard have been people weighing the ethical concerns, and what might be viewed as effective practices. So how should people be weighing those two concepts in their mind as they go forth to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and one of the classes I teach here at Binghamton is ethics, and we talk about how issues are not just one or the other, right? It's either this way or it's that way. There's often these gray areas, and how do you kind of navigate those gray areas? And the answer to that is you decide, well, where's the majority of the harm, right? And so in my calculations, the majority of the harm is in reinforcing biological race for the medical legal community and for the public. To me, that just outweighs, and again, this is one of those things that, I've been thinking about for a long time and kind of been struggling with for a long time. And I think I even have a sentence in that 2013 book chapter about that balance of the benefit to identifying a person versus the problem with reinforcing biological race. And at the time, I opined that the benefit was that there was more benefit in getting somebody identified. And that societal responsibility that we have to be actively anti-racist. If it means that, by not including an ancestry estimate, it takes a little bit longer to identify somebody, so be it, right? And that might sound harsh to a lot of our colleagues, but I think being anti-racist is probably the defining moment of our time. It is the defining moment, and I really think that the future of the United States rests on our ability, not to be too dramatic, and I'm trying not to be, but right, but the future of the United States, and certainly as we could see, just politically, what happened the past 4 years, and that's a whole nother conversation, but the future rests on our ability to grapple with our racist history and the racist structures that we have set up, and our ability to break those down. And as an anthropologist, as a professor, as a human being, I do not want to be complicit in that system. I want to contribute to breaking that system down. And so if that means that I don't write in my report that, the victim was African American, even though, I can look at the skull and maybe, take some measurements and look at some features and so forth, then so be it.
Yeah, I'll say as well that, in life, we've talked about, thinking changes, certainly the practice of forensic anthropology changes, and what is expected of practitioners can change. And I agree with Dr. DiGangi that if I think that what I'm doing is fundamentally causing more harm in the long term, then I agree that it's not worth doing. And so I've also resolved that in my own work, despite what feels like enormous pressure not to, ancestry estimation is not part of my own SOP. And if at some point, the field decides, no, ancestry must be, in order to call yourself a forensic anthropologist, you have to do this. Well, then, the choice is made for me. I know what I'm not going to be doing. And that is engaging with the topic in the methodological way that I have before, right? It's just not compatible with the way that I see myself as a forensic anthropologist and the way that I see forensic anthropology as part of the larger anthropological discipline in the system that we're working in, et cetera. And if it puts me and maybe Dr. DiGangi on our own island, well, you know what? So be it, right? I think part of what we both have think, and I don't want to speak for her, but I think both of us have also recognized we have enormous privilege being in universities that support academic freedom, the ability to write and think, right? Part about being a professor is a thinker and a writer, and having that thought process protected in all the ways in which many of us hold academic freedom dear. So I think that fundamentally too, we have to be able to do that, right? We can't censor ourselves to fit in some other preconceived idea that has a long disciplinary history. We have to sort of go with what we think, and I think that's what we're doing.
So it sounds like since that 2020 editorial call to action to look into this, to the question of is it harmful or helpful, it sounds like you guys have come to some sort of conclusion in the evolution of your thinking that it is leaning more towards harmful. And is that because of the incorporation of the work from other fields in criminal justice that has really led you to feel that we have enough concrete research, even if it's outside of forensic anthropology itself, to make that determination?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we purposefully included critical race theory. I really wanted to engage with this at a higher level, and based on some of the feedback that we received after the editorial came out, I thought to myself, okay, there are some people who just aren't getting it, right? There were a lot of people who did, but there were some people who just were not getting it. And so I need to tap into some social theory so I can further contextualize this for the people who don't get it, but who are still willing to, maybe open their minds a little bit and engage with it. Obviously, there remain people who are just not willing to do that at all. And there's nothing I can do about that. But for those who don't get it, but are willing to maybe think about it in a different way. But when we really started diving into some of the literature from criminology and criminal justice and sociology, that allowed us to further contextualize that hypothesis. And it remains a hypothesis. And I do want to emphasize this. We have not tested this hypothesis, but part of the way science works is you construct a hypothesis based on evidence that already exists, right? Like you don't just come up with a question out of thin air. There's evidence that's out there that makes you ask this scientific question, which is what a hypothesis is. And so the evidence that exists, that is very clear, that is incontrovertible, that is undeniable about the racism and bias that the criminal justice system essentially is based on. So things like children who are arrested, more for the same crime, more Black boys will be sentenced as adults than white boys for the same crime, and they will receive longer sentences. Things like children of color who were abducted as compared to white children, they go unrecovered for longer than those white children. So those white children are found and returned to their families in a quicker period of time. Things like more when people are pulled over by the police, people of color are more likely to have force used against them than are white people. Certainly things like who is it who gets killed by the police, right? So certainly Black men are killed at a much higher rate than white men. All of these things, these are just very, very clear sort of lines of evidence in the criminal justice literature, and just, from reading the newspaper, right? It's fairly evident. And so we, in particular, what we mention in that editorial and what we mention again in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology paper is white woman syndrome, which is where
missing white women.
Missing, thank you. Missing, not just white woman syndrome, or that
whole different thing.
That's a whole different thing, right? Missing, thank you, Dr. Bethard. Missing white women syndrome, where the media and law enforcement focus disproportionately on missing and murdered white women and girls. And so the example I like to use is, all of us, sort of a thought experiment, think about the famous cases that about from, just being alive and, watching the news or whatever, of, missing people. All of them, and I feel comfortable saying that, right? All of them are white women, white little girls, Kaylee Anthony, Natalie Holloway, JonBenet Ramsey, Madeline McCann, right? I mean, we can kind of just name them off, boom, 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 boom. In terms of, Black women who are missing, I can't name one, right? I can't name one. And so, and that would, just that media attention would make you believe that, it's only white women and white little girls who go missing, right? And that's obviously not the case. And so that there's a clear demonstrated bias there. And so we use that in concert with these other lines of evidence, as well as others that I mentioned, from the criminology and criminal justice literature, to formulate our hypothesis that, maybe if we include ancestry in our report and we say that this person was anything but white, that that case, it might take longer to get that case resolved. And I want to be clear that we're not, saying this is only because the investigators are, diehard racists. No, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that the criminal justice system is built on a bedrock of racism. It's sort of intertwined into the entire system. So, it may not be that, you could have a dedicated detective who is totally anti-racist, right? And lives an anti-racist life, but maybe they're in a jurisdiction where that police precinct has not been given enough resources. There's not enough money. So there's a lot of missing people in that particular jurisdiction, but there's only one detective who, was in charge of the missing persons cases. And they have, a caseload of, they're always behind by 100 cases, right? That's part of structural racism too. Maybe you have a family where, the daughter went missing or whatever, and they are really reticent to go to the police and file a missing persons report because of, various previous encounters with the police, because of, various preconceived notions about, how they'll be treated if they go to the police, because, of fear. They don't want, something bad to happen while they're at the police. They don't want, the police to laugh at them. They don't want to take the time, take off from work to go down there and, then, oh, we'll call you, right? Or, worse, be told, oh, they'll be back. They'll probably just be back tomorrow. What, 16-year-old girl? Oh, she probably just ran away. She probably, just got in with some friends, right? Which is also structured by racism, right? And that's certainly what's happened. For example, there are reports of that, of the missing Indigenous women crisis in Canada, where parents will go to the police and they're told, oh, she's probably just, she probably just ran away, or she's probably just doing this or that. Meanwhile, if a white girl who's 15 years old goes missing in the middle of nowhere, it's like you bring out, every single police officer to look for her. So that's the point that we're trying to make, is that we know that there is bias embedded in the criminal justice system. And we constructed this hypothesis on the basis of that. And we feel like we know that it's a strongly constructed hypothesis. Again, we still need to test it, right? But the hypothesis is sound.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly to this that one of the things that we've found interesting as well is discussions about the accuracy rates with positively identified cases. And there is literature about that. But what's really also interesting is the enormous number of unidentified people. And if students don't know about a resource called NamUs, which is a database which stands for the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, namus.gov. You can use this website. It is a website which is a clearinghouse for coroners and medical examiners, for example, to make a database of the number of missing, unidentified, and unclaimed people in those offices, in those jurisdictions around the United States. And so 13,000, last time I looked, it's 13,630, I believe. That's a lot of people, right? And so to assume that maybe every single demographic parameter is correct is also feeding our hypothesis about just how good we are in this endeavor. Very recently, I think a great article by Meyer et al. That looks at language use and what are the words that we even use? What are the words that people use to describe themselves that are used in literature, et cetera? How do we even call groups? What do we call each other? How do we label this body in our report that translates with that NamUs database? Do forensic anthropologists provide more than one answer? Do we agree on how we do that? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What about when our analyses are inconclusive? Do we have a fallback where we report it as unknown? Do we choose one category or another? And I think that there's so many layered answers to all of those questions that also create just a moment for pause in that maybe we're not as good at it as we think we are. Or maybe we're better at it for the dominant groups, mostly white and Black people, that really get down to the origins of physical anthropology and the skeletal collections that were created in the early 20th century, and the age-old Black-white sort of question that has permeated physical anthropology and forensic anthropology for so much of its history. So there's just layer upon layer of question about all of this, which leads to the hypothesis that we've postulated about the ways in which biases may enter in once we report the information.
So it has been mentioned multiple times that there's a bedrock or of a foundation of these oppressive realities, making them systematic. And it's also been discussed briefly a bit of the history of how physical anthropology was founded, and we came about the trait terminology, etc. So is ancestry estimation inextricably linked to social race, and how are forensic reports validating the concept of social race?
Great question.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. As I said before, physical anthropology was created as racial science, right? That it was created to differentiate between what anatomists, who were the ones, and doctors were the ones who created the discipline. So it was created to say, this is white male biology, this is white female biology, this is Black male biology, this is Black female biology, with the express purpose being to say, guess what? Big surprise, white male biology is the best, right? And that's followed by white female biology. They're pretty good too. They're not as smart as we are. Their cranial capacity is a little less, but you know, they're still up there, followed by everybody else, right? So that's essentially the history of the discipline. And of course, the social race categories were also created as well, right? And that goes back a little bit further when we're talking about sort of the history of Western exploration and explorers, European explorers, you know, running into people in different parts of the world who looked and acted, you know, vastly different, and had different customs and different religions and ate different foods and wore different clothes and all of these kinds of things. So a need to kind of classify that variation that was being seen. And so the sort of the logical at the time, the logical thinking was, well, they're so different, they've got to be something different than us, right? That they're just so wildly different. They, you know, some of them don't wear any clothes or barely any clothes. They eat these weird things. They don't worship a Christian God. They've got to be something different. And so we have to label them. And so out of the need to label them came the need to say, okay, well, there's got to be a biological basis for this, right? The labels obviously had already been created, but there's got to be a biological basis for this. So, you know, the question of, you know, is ancestry estimation sort of inextricably linked with social race. I mean, absolutely. Like these are categories that we created. And so essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at what are the features on the skull in particular that allow us then to take people and force them into these groups that we have already constructed, right? There's no decoupling that. And there are forensic anthropologists who will argue and who have argued in publications and blog posts and things of that nature that no, we're just saying, we're not, we don't say that, ancestry and social race are one and the same thing. And, John and I, Dr. Bethard and I make the point in our paper that is just beyond illogical, because if that were true, then why do we do it? Right? Like, why are we doing it? If we just tell the police like, oh, this person has a post-traumatic depression, what are they going to do with that? They don't know what that means, right? We're the ones who are telling them what that means. So, we can say, we can explain all we want that the variation that we're describing is not social race. And that may or may not be true. And we can have a different conversation about that. But what the police care about is social race, because that is what is reported on missing persons reports, right? They care. Were they white? Were they Black? Were they Hispanic? Were they Asian? Were they Native American? Like, that's what they care about. That's it. So it's absolutely linked and inextricably. We can't, as we say in the paper, there's no way to disentangle this. It's simply not possible. Simply not possible.
I would also argue that so much of this original idea has its origin because of the way in which documented skeletal samples were created in the United States. And if students watching this are unaware, that would be something to look up and to learn a little about the Heyman Todd osteological collection in Cleveland and the Terry collection, which is now in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian, but was created from St. Louis. And I think something that was lost on me as a student, where I knew that these collections existed, I didn't think enough about how those people came to be. We learned that those were mostly impoverished folks, but what was not clear to me at the time, and has been made more clear to me through reading the extensive work of Professor Carlina de la Cova from the University of South Carolina, which examines who the people were, specifically the people who moved as part of the Great Migration from the South in post-Reconstruction Civil War Jim Crow, how those folks moved as a major migration away from oppression to St. Louis and Cleveland. But lo and behold, those folks who were Black didn't show up somewhere that welcomed them with open arms, that didn't provide enormous opportunities. Certainly things might have been better, but still people ended up so poor that when they died, they were anatomized, right? And their bodies were put into these collections, which involved also for white people. So you had these skeletal samples that predominantly reflected white and Black folks, which feeds back into the loop of early physical anthropologists looking for and thinking about white and Black differences. And it's it's sort of this history, the social history of the United States that fed into why the Great Migration happened, why people moved places and still ended up being poor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no way for me to think about the practice that I'm engaged in today and the practice of ancestry right now without thinking about, well, how did this come to be at all? How did those samples come to be? Who are the people? How did they get there? And this is interesting because Professor de la Cova is not the first person to write about who the migrants were and the Great Migration. Professor William Montague Cobb in the 1930s was writing about this, including writing about people who survived slavery and were part of the Great Migration and who ended up being anatomized. And I think that there's just this enormous history to unpack that's directly linked with the history of the United States, that, fundamentally, when we engage in the practice of ancestry estimation, we're really doing something that has a long-standing relationship with this hierarchical creation of racialized biology, which was what physical anthropology's intention was.
Right. But we'd like to think, some of our colleagues like to think, no, we've divorced ourselves from that now. Yes, what a shame that all of that was horrible and bad, and we don't want to go back there. But we've divorced it. We're fully divorced from that because we use statistics now, right? Or some similar facile argument. Sorry, that it doesn't work that way, right? That's not how it works. It's still part of it's part and parcel of our discipline, and we have not done a sufficient job of reckoning with it at all.
So in that conversation, taking in the context of our history as a discipline and the history of our collections, we arrive in that AJPA article at the term white supremacy, which for some people, I believe, felt like a bombshell. So do you want to talk more about why you specifically used that term in this context? And are you saying that white supremacy is inherent to the field, or that you're calling out certain practices as supporting or being rooted in white supremacy?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, Laura. So I mentioned earlier that we decided to use critical race theory, and so I'll start there, and then I'll segue into the white supremacy questions. So as I mentioned before, we decided to use critical race theory, and the reason we decided to do that is it was invented, created, conceptualized, theorized by law scholars and lawyers in response to the entrenched racial biases in the criminal justice system, and it's been used successfully in a variety of other disciplines. And so we decided that, as I think I mentioned earlier, that there was a need to contextualize our overall critique. So just coming out and saying we have this hypothesis that because of bias we know that exists in the criminal justice system, that we suspect that there is a possibility that people will not be identified, or will take longer to get them identified if we classify them as anything, other than white. Saying that in and of itself is kind of a bombshell and very provocative, right? And so in that AJPA piece, I thought we've got to provide some more context for this, right? And the way to do that was through using something like critical race theory, which talks about these issues of structural racism and how embedded it is essentially in the fabric of American society, to the point where if it doesn't affect us directly, we don't see it. And that's part of the insidious nature of it, right? So if you're a person with light skin who really lives, pick any place in the United States, you're not necessarily going to encounter structural racism, right? You might see somebody, the Starbucks barista or, whatever coffee shop, right, who says to a Black person, hey, you got to wait outside for your coffee. But, maybe you'll notice that as being racism, maybe not. Maybe you'll have a different opinion because the person who was asked to, wait outside was, being argumentative or whatever, right? Who knows? But if you are a person who is not light-skinned, you're going to have a lot more experiences of being discriminated against yourself, and also of having your eyes open to being primed to see it, right, when it happens, because you know what it looks like. And so that's essentially what critical race theory is about. It's about opening our eyes to what structural racism is, where it is, which essentially is everywhere. And once we can identify it, then we can start to say, okay, how do we start to break this down? And so where does white supremacy come into this? So I think when people see the term white supremacy, obviously, yes, it is very provocative. And actually among critical race theorists themselves, there's a really interesting debate and disagreement about whether or not to use the term. And some will say, yes, you got to call a spade a spade. Others will say, no, it's too provocative, and you've immediately kind of turned people off, and they're not going to be willing to engage with these very important issues. So if we use language that's maybe a little bit softer, then you might be able to pull people in a little bit more rather than, saying white supremacy, right? And I do see, I see there's merits to both arguments. In the end, I decided, no, you have to call a spade, and you have to educate people as to what you mean by the terminology. We can't sugarcoat this. It's uncomfortable. It's painful, but we're not going to get through it if we're sugarcoating it, right? That we're adults, right? We need to learn how to be able to handle this. And so, what is white supremacy? It's the concept that essentially white men, largely upper class white men, have created this system for themselves that works for them. And it only works for them. Sometimes other people might be able to benefit from the systems that they have set in place. And by systems, what am I talking about? I'm talking about essentially the system of capitalism. I'm talking about the system of government. Everything, the way that our society is structured and works, it has been white males who largely have been in charge of designing it, and they've designed it in a way so that it works for them, right? Now, sometimes has that been deliberate to exclude people? Absolutely. Other times has it not been deliberate to exclude people, but that is still the outcome? Absolutely, right? So if you think about, pick whatever Fortune 500 company in the United States, if we go to those boardrooms and there's 20 board members, how many of those are rich white males? The vast majority. Now, are some of those companies, maybe trying to make some deliberate choices? Hey, we really do, want a woman. We really do want a Black person. Okay, so you've got your one token woman, your two token women, right? You've got your one token Black person. But ultimately, the decisions that are made in that room are still going to be decisions that are in the best interest of the identities of the people who are in that room. And they may not, even if they want to acknowledge, that other people exist, right? People with differing, maybe different experiences, people who look different. If they don't know what those experiences are, there's no way they're going to be able to set policies that would allow for those voices to be heard, or that would allow for any sort of consideration of how do we make things better for people who might, be of a different race, people who might have different experiences. And so that's what white supremacy is. So we're talking about, mainly middle or upper class white cisgendered men, heterosexual men, neurotypical men, able-bodied men, right? So there's this sort of intersectional aspect of it too, right? So gay men might be able to tap into, gay white men might be able to tap into some of the benefits of whiteness, right? But maybe not all of the benefits of whiteness. Men who are on the autism spectrum might be able, depending on where in the spectrum they are, right, might be able to tap into some of those benefits, but not necessarily all of them. Women might be able to tap into, white women might be able to tap into a lot of the benefits, but not all of them, right? And so thinking about how those different pieces of your identity, do I need to use, a wheelchair to get around or not? Do I need, any kind of accommodations or not? Do I, have white skin or not? All of those things, right? So that's what white supremacy is. And we decided that we needed to talk about that because yes, absolutely, it most definitely characterizes our discipline. It characterizes every discipline. It characterizes science, Western science in general. I mean, if we look at the American Board of Forensic Anthropology, Dr. Bethard and I are both board certified by the ABFA. The vast majority of members historically, so those who are retired now, and even those who are passed away, and those who are still living, still active, the vast majority are white. Every single board member on the elected board of directors is white. Every single one. Granted, it is a small field, right? It's kind of a niche field, but that's still the reality of how it is. And so you look at that and you have to think about, okay, who has been excluded and why? Has it been, and even if it hasn't been deliberate, right? That it may not have been deliberate, but that doesn't matter. It's still excluding, right? It's still excluding. And so within the discipline, we have to think about, in every discipline, how are we being implicitly or explicitly, how are we excluding people, right? By just in general, in terms of our, the way our meetings are set up and our membership structure and things like that. But also how the methods that we use, the research that we do, the way that we talk about the methods that we use, is that exclusionary too? And if you were, a student in forensic anthropology in the early 1990s, when the Gill and Ryan Skeletal Attribution of Race book came out, and if you're, a Black student or a Hispanic student, and you open that book and you turn to the page and there's, line drawings of skulls and it says Mongoloid, Negroid, Caucasoid, that's exclusionary. There's no question about it. And I remember seeing that, as a student and being uncomfortable with that, but I wanted to do anthropology so badly. And at the time, I really didn't know what else I was going to do with my life. And I had, put so much into anthropology that I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. But if you're some, undergraduate, I could see where an undergraduate would see that. And then also when you see that, your professors are all white, we have an undergraduate intro to anthropology course here. And there have been times we co-teach it. So we have 3 professors teach, the different parts, archaeology, cultural and biological anthropology. And there have been times when it's all white males teaching all 3 parts. And I have spoken up in the department, what are we doing? We have 400 freshman students. This is our opportunity to demonstrate what anthropology is. And if we're doing that with, fine, you have 1 professor, fine, but 3 professors, like we couldn't come up with, with one, diverse person, right? Somebody who's not a white male for intro to anthropology, give me a break, right? We've got to do better than that. We've got to have strategies in place to do better than that. And so I know that's a long answer to the question of why white supremacy, but white supremacy patterns every scientific discipline. It patterns everything, right? It patterns Fortune 500 companies. It patterns the United States Congress, right? It patterns all of it. And the only way we can start to break up that pattern is when we identify what it is and we say, look, we're shining a spotlight. We see this is what's happening. We see that there's a problem. Okay, how do we start to dismantle this? How do we start to bring in voices of people who have been underrepresented and allow their voices to start to take precedence in the discipline above the voices which have been privileged for so long?
I just want to add one piece to this, and that is sort of thinking about the present as informed by the past. And in both the editorial and the AJPA article, we evoke the lost cause. And it's interesting for me as a person I'm a Virginian. I'm born and raised in Central Virginia, 30 minutes from the Appomattox courthouse, where the Civil War ended. And so I think that history and learning Virginia history is something that is impressionable on me and probably many other people from the South. But it's important to think about this conversation and the use of the phrase lost cause and the way in which we can remember history differently, right? The monuments that we have seen across the United States and indeed the world, but in the US specifically, of Robert E. Lee, of this Confederate general, that Confederate statue, so on and so forth, were installed at a time when people were trying to commemorate and remember those people who fought for the Confederacy. And the Confederate States of America was the ultimate grasp for white supremacy, because the Confederacy wanted to keep slavery going, right? Doesn't matter that during the process of Reconstruction, that ideas about why the Civil War happened were because of states' rights or this or that or whatever people think they know. The cause of the Civil War was about slavery, right? Which is embedded in the biological race concept, etc. That's obvious. But now we are at a point in 2021 where we look around and we say, how could there be so many monuments? How could there be debates about them? Why are people so passionate that they need to stay? Because folks think that the war was about heroism and valor and people fighting for their own rights, which of course sounds like a good thing, but that history has been changed to benefit folks, and changing it, in addition to having been an act of white supremacy, perpetuates white supremacy. So I think that in terms of just this conversation in general, it's impossible to look at the moment of the discussion or the moment of the discipline or the time and say, well, this is happening now. Like, what is this debate? Because it's decades of development. It's a long and deeply rooted history that cannot be disentangled. It is this enormously complex question. And so I think that, just to supplement what Dr. DiGangi said, it's useful to sort of think about the analogies that we've invoked, to think about sort of the argument that we're making now too.
Right. Yeah. And part of that, we talk in the paper as well about the concept of denial. And Dr. Michael Blakey has written about this as well. And certainly, in human rights scholarship, we think about denial and the people who, deny the Holocaust, or deny that, it was 6 million Jews who were killed, or who deny, any genocide or any, mass atrocity, the people who deny the Armenian genocide, and so forth. And there's a power in denial, because you're taking away your responsibility for having been involved in that, or of even having to acknowledge it if you weren't involved in it directly. But it takes away the agency of the people who were affected by it, right? So for those people who would say, oh, the Civil War was because of, was not because of slavery, or that was, a minor concern, maybe that was part of it, but it wasn't the reason. That's an act of denial, and that's an act of removing agency from people who would say, no, that this is really the way that it was. And for me, that's also an act of white supremacy, right? That you are reinforcing the order that you have established as, an upper class, neurotypical, able-bodied, et cetera, white male. You are reinforcing that order, the order that benefits you in your own interests, by saying, no, these other things haven't happened. And that, for some of the pushback that we've received on the paper, where people are just straight up saying, no, 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 no. For me, that's all denial, and that's all white supremacy. And that's why we thought it important to call it out.
So removing the analogous monuments in anthropology looks like removing these methodologies in our practice. It looks like removing certain representation across the board from white males in particular in teaching and practice and all these other things. Are there any other sort of metaphorical monuments that you think we need to remove?
Metaphorical or concrete?
Sure, yes.
Yeah, I'll have one. I think we need to remove the barriers for the importance of certification by the ABFA in terms of what makes a person qualified to be a forensic anthropologist at all. There have been a lot of structures in place by the power brokers of the ABFA to make it a really exclusive club. And it's been that way for a really long time, to our detriment, because there are more cases that occur and there are more needs for forensic anthropologists who could potentially be embedded in the system of the coroner's office or the medical examiner's office directly, as opposed to university professors who are consulting on an as-needed basis. So I think that if we somehow, this is any ABFA people who are watching this, if we ever get a chance to vote on multi-level certification, for example, vote yes on multi-level certification. But I think there's a structural issue because we see that coroner's offices and medical examiner's offices are not hiring forensic anthropologists, despite all of the things that we tout about ourselves. I use the state of Florida as a really good example, as it's the third most populated state now. There are 25 medical examiner districts here. It's 25 opportunities for forensic anthropologists to have jobs, and yet there's about 6 university professors who look at the skeletons in the state of Florida. And we see the successes, for example, in places like Harris County, Texas, and New York City, and in Pima County and Maricopa County, when anthropologists are on staff in those places. And so it's a detriment to everyone in Florida that myself or one of my colleagues or one of my students isn't embedded in an office all the time. And I think that that's a barrier that we need to work to combat, so that the places where forensic anthropology is needed most in many aspects of missing persons, cold case, human identification, etc., that the anthropological expertise is there, and it's part of it. It's not supplemented. It's not consulted on an as-needed basis. It's there, and we see it in certain areas, but most places don't. So I think that's one example that I hope, through reimagining the qualifications of what it means to be a forensic anthropologist, is a really concrete way to try and make the entire discipline better by pulling more people in and not keeping it as a very exclusive active gatekeeping.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't have any other brilliant ideas off the top of my head, but I absolutely would agree with that. That it would enable the discipline to grow, right, and to grow in some very beneficial ways. And part of the reason why every medical examiner's office and coroner's office don't have a forensic anthropologist, and we have been trying over the years to educate medical examiners, et cetera, about the benefit to using an anthropologist. But part of this issue, and it doesn't exactly answer the question, but to some extent, many of us have done our work for free. I don't know many lawyers who, do all their cases pro bono, right? That doesn't happen, right? Medical examiners aren't doing their cases pro bono. I went to school for a long time to learn how to do this. It took me a long time to study for that exam, and I had to make, there were several sacrifices along the way, in my personal life and my professional life that I couldn't do or wasn't doing because I was, so fixated on the exam, because I was so fixated on, I've got to write my master's thesis. I've got to, get my dissertation done. I had to move to another country to get a job in forensic anthropology. I had to be willing to make that sacrifice, and just all the other sacrifices along the way. I didn't do all of those things to do this work for free, right? And so that's another conversation that we need to have in forensic anthropology overall. But there's no question that opening it up to master students to take an exam would enable us to have more of those kinds of conversations, because then we could say, okay, we've got this group of qualified people, they need jobs. Let's figure out how do we lobby the different medical examiners' offices and really show the benefit to hiring someone full-time who can do this kind of work, and not just the skeletal cases, as Dr. Bethard mentioned. So, what's the benefit to having an anthropologist with an anthropological viewpoint on your staff? And we haven't necessarily done a very good job of demonstrating that. We've done a very good job of demonstrating, oh, look, I can analyze a skeleton. Well, how many jurisdictions have a skeleton, have enough skeletons that turn up, right, that would warrant, paying somebody, $70,000 a year or whatever to do this work? Not many. But there's other things we can do, as he mentioned, right? Disaster victim identification, cold case, missing persons, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really where we need to work on just the education of our colleagues in the medical legal death field.
So forensic anthropologists are able to do this analysis and provide these reports that are distributed to law enforcement, but it's clear we don't actually have employment in these different types of offices. So at what stage of the medical legal process should responsibility for addressing social race concepts and the repercussions be taken?
It's a big question.
Yeah, every stage.
Yeah.
It's got to be taken at every stage, right? If we haven't, trained law enforcement or the public, taught them about the nuances of ancestry estimation, that's kind of on us, but that's also on science in general, right? So it's not just anthropology's responsibility. It's also the field of medicine's responsibility. I mean, medicine has been has really been derelict in their duty in, non-critically doing these studies where they will be like, we studied breast cancer in, Black women and Hispanic women and white women, and they don't define what any of those categories are. And then they non-critically say, oh, I'm just making this up, I don't know. But, there was more, breast cancer in Black women versus the white women. Well, can we talk about that a little bit, right? We're just kind of throwing categories here. Or, the studies that have looked at, the cardiology drug, the heart disease drug, I don't know if it was for blood pressure, heart disease, whatever it was for, that was marketed specifically to Black people in the United States. And there were, Black cardiologists who were like, yeah, this is a great idea, right? So even the scientists themselves aren't, necessarily engaging with race and racism overall. So the responsibility really needs to be at every point. Now, obviously, different people in that chain might have more or less amounts of responsibility depending on their knowledge, right, and so forth. But as I said at the beginning, the United States is not going to survive if we do not, as we would like it to be, as idealistically as we would, want our country to be, if every single American does not, start to take responsibility for grappling with these issues. And I know that's sort of pie in the sky. Like, do I really believe that, every American is going to give a damn about these issues? I mean, there's a large segment of Americans who don't, but, I'd like to get to the point where, that number is reversed, right? Where the majority of Americans give a damn about these issues and want to educate themselves about these issues, want to educate their kids about these issues, want to, as I said before, live an anti-racist life.
And to that end, we are certainly not naive about the process of human identification in the medical examiner's office, in coroner's office. We recognize that if, for example, the variable of ancestry is not provided, that there's some discordance between, well, what information is taken in the missing persons report, et cetera. We get that. We understand what we're saying, that we're complicating this. But at the same time, we also recognize it's not the variable of ancestry that leads to the positive identification either, right? So if, as a community, there can be some stock taking as to this entire issue, if we can think about what are the mechanisms that make the ID, right? Well, maybe the mechanisms that make the ID require, more antemortem data gathering. Well, maybe that requires more money to employ more people. Maybe another, staffing, et cetera. We get that it's complicated. We understand that. We cite work of our colleague, Dr. Heather Walsh-Haney, and her student, who describe what happens when ancestry information is not included, right? We understand what we're implying and saying, and we still think it's worth the risk to do. We think it's worth the endeavor because the benefit for once and for all, making it clear that biological anthropologists and skeletal biologists recognize the fallacy of biological race outweighs even delaying that time period. And that's novel, and we know that there's tension within this idea, but that is the direction that we're taking this argument.
And considering that same weighing outside of forensics and applying it to other areas of anthropology, for example, in bioarchaeology, ancestry estimation comes up very frequently, especially in NAGPRA contexts. Is that weight in your eyes shifted to we see a benefit in the utility of ancestry estimation in those cases where it might be serving those populations more than harming them? Or do you see that same ethical question or unknown?
Yeah, you know, Dr. Bethard and I have talked a lot about this. And it's a really good question. I'm going to let him.
Well, I think first there is context, right? Context is key, and that people, when it comes to NAGPRA and the jurisdictions of NAGPRA and nuances of state and federally recognized groups, et cetera, it's obvious that there are going to be contextual clues, maybe, that will suggest that in general, NAGPRA is even on the table at all. You know, whether those are museum collections, university collections, et cetera, that are on a NAGPRA inventory or that are in the process of being inventoried, or in the cases of construction projects where human remains are encountered that appear to be of archaeological age and or of non-forensic significance. And it is certainly nuanced within the realm of NAGPRA for even how local stakeholders and federally recognized tribes want that process engaged as well. So what I might do or have done in the state of Florida with members of the Seminole Nation are different from what colleagues in other places are doing because of the heterogeneity in tribal responses to NAGPRA cases. And so in terms of the methodological questions as well, particularly with the areas of biological anthropology in terms of the toolkit, metric dimensions, et cetera, that we know a little bit more about heritability, there's less, for me, it's slightly less loaded because while certainly repatriation efforts and museums and that system has been violent, right? NAGPRA wouldn't exist had it not been for the structural violence perpetuated by archaeologists and bioarchaeologists. It's still a different context in the criminal justice system, right? So it's thorny in a different way, right? It's also quite likely that the labels for which would be ascribed to a particular skeleton may not even be the same kinds of labels that we see in those nameless checkboxes, right? So I think it's distinct, and I haven't necessarily provided a concrete answer here, but I say like there's nuance and there's distinction between the two concepts or contexts, and I think that that is all right. I also just say that in general, when it comes to what bioarchaeologists do, when we think about biological distance analysis and thinking about population structures and the way in which that work has proceeded, it's still a really different thing from looking at one particular individual and applying the tools for ancestry estimation to that individual.
With that, John, would you also agree that more research or analysis into and asking the actual practitioners of NAGPRA whether or not they're actually implementing and utilizing ancestry estimation for those repatriations is necessary? Because I would say that of the practitioners I know of NAGPRA, that it's not as hierarchical of a need and a necessity the way I think some of the argument is being made within forensic anthropology to utilize ancestry estimation.
Yeah, and I think it's very complex because, again, particularly with skeletons of ancestors that have already been excavated, there's a lot of time, I mean, really ranges. Sometimes there's good documentation, sometimes there's not. And so it's almost down to the level of the particular case and the particular description of what's there that is, it's highly variable. And so it's also, again, based on the location. Not to say that I live in Florida, but there could certainly be remains in Florida from some other part of the United States where NAGPRA would apply, or some other federally recognized group. So it's, again, I'll go back to what I said, it's complex in a different way, but also sometimes the direct answer may not be possible if you're in an area where maybe there are overlapping or very nearby geographies, and it might be impossible to say, well, this skeleton came from this ancestral homeland as opposed to a very nearby neighboring ancestral homeland. So it's just really complicated. It's a bit of a cop-out, but it is. It's complicated.
Yeah. Or when the ancestry estimation disqualifies that individual from being repatriated to a certain group, I think really plays into that discussion about how there are many instances in which ancestry estimation could be more harmful than beneficiary.
Yeah, and we saw this with Kennewick Man, right? It was, under, legislation for years, and the moment the DNA was done, surprise, surprise, right? This indeed is a Native American ancestor. Didn't matter what the skeletal biology said, right? The DNA was kind of the bottom line there. So yeah, so that absolutely would be a concern, because with the ancestry estimation too, something that we haven't talked about yet really is the reference samples and the composition of the reference sample, right? So your answer, and this is true for anything really in forensic anthropology when we need to use reference samples, the quality of your answer is dependent on the composition of your reference sample. So if your reference sample for Native Americans is sample size of 20 or whatever, 50 from one particular tribe from one particular time period, that's going to be a problem, right? Because we're talking about dozens of tribes over, several hundred years. Obviously, there's sectoral change that would come into play. People mating, maybe between tribes or whatever. Like, there's all these factors that we have to think about. So the quality of or composition, rather, I don't want to say quality of a reference, just the composition of that sample would be a key thing that we would need to know and understand, particularly if in a NAGPRA kind of situation, if we were primarily relying on that ancestry estimate to repatriate somebody.
And I'll just speak to one example that I've had here specifically that involved NAGPRA and the reality of, in Florida, preservation that is really bad. Sometimes it's not the skeletal evidence that is useful. It might be material culture or otherwise that suggests something about an individual's identity. And I think that, I would encourage any student who is listening to this to think about, for their location, what might be the NAGPRA process? Who are the NAGPRA stakeholders? What about your Tribal Historic Preservation Office? What about your State Historic Preservation Office? And so certainly this is a really important conversation, and people may recognize or they may learn that they could have a lot to offer in their particular area, especially if it's an area where maybe there is no forensic anthropologist or bioarchaeologist. And I think that there are opportunities with regard to this question that that continue to be played out as NAGPRA changes. I mean, we're now even thinking about, what about culturally unaffiliated remains? How can those be claimed, and who can claim them, and how they can claim them, so on and so forth. So NAGPRA in and of itself is a big issue that we all should probably think more about, because it has been so prominent. Not to mention recent efforts that are recognizing the way in which historic Black cemeteries have been erased from the landscape, and the way in which the skeletons of possibly enslaved or free Black folks have been incorporated into museum collections, university collections, etc. Right? So thinking in general about our relationship to skeletons and working on the bodies of other people, and how this raises ethical questions in so many different circumstances.
So have you seen, since the publication of the initial editorial and the publication in AJPA, have you seen these actions applied yet in the field? And what, if any, shifts are beginning to emerge from your perspective?
I think that people are talking about it, right? I mean, I think we really lit a fire. I hope we did. We, got the avalanche going, down the mountain, so to speak. And I hope, my hope is that it's unstoppable. I think that we're, kind of at a sea change moment in the discipline. We're also at a sea change moment, in the history of the United States with everything that's happening, from George Floyd to what happened in Atlanta last week, right? So what we've seen specifically certainly are a lot of people who have reached out to us personally, via email or phone, to say, either, hey, this is great, I've been thinking about this for a long time, or hey, this is not so great, I don't really like this at all, and I've got some problems with it. But some concrete things that we've seen, the Society of Forensic Anthropologists, they put together a sort of a special, wasn't really a webinar, it was more, I guess, a conversation. I'm not sure exactly what they called it, but of 50 or 60 people or so. And they took a lot of time. I really commend them. They did an excellent job gathering comments, from the forensic anthropology community, students and professors and professionals, morgues and so forth. Put together this document of comments, and then boiled that down into different topics, different thematic topics. And for the people who signed up, place them into breakout rooms. And this is your question. These are your series of questions that you're going to talk about for 45 minutes. And then we're going to come together and discuss them as a group. And those sort of group summaries, they put together in a document and made that freely available. So that, I think, is a concrete thing that has come out of this, and just all the conversations. I mean, a lot of people have told me, certainly after the editorial, and then again after the AJPA paper, there was a lot of talk today in the lab, right? Some people are really reconsidering their projects, thinking about, more seriously or more in depth than they have before, their future in the discipline, what it means to be a forensic anthropologist. So I think there are a lot of people having these really meaningful yet difficult conversations, and that's I think that's kind of step one as we move towards some of these changes that we'd like to see. But that's what I've seen so far. I don't know, Dr. Bethard, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, the same. It's been interesting to me that people who I have not had conversations with have reached out. People who have reached out to say, the way it's been described is, we've chatted about this in the back of the conference room, but we didn't speak up because how could we possibly? And that's from professional and student alike. There's been a lot of people that have said it's nice to sort of see on paper what I've been thinking about for a long time. So we hit on something that was there and is moving in many directions with many different kinds of conversations. I can also speak practically. I can think of one lab that has changed an SOP about what they're doing. It certainly for myself has made me reimagine my own SOPs and my own approach to teaching and what I am going to be doing moving forward with how I engage on this topic specifically. So the answer is, yeah, there's been movement, and this field is one that has been slow to move. And we maybe took that away from this topic, and we sort of, gave it a push.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and we want to continue. We want to continue pushing, right? Just continue pushing the envelope, and I think, as we mentioned at the beginning, that academic freedom is so important. So we do, both of us really recognize the privilege that we have in being able to speak up and say, wait a minute, I've got some, especially since this is a politically charged topic, right? We're not talking about, some controversy over, fire ants in the Amazon, and I don't know, do they live in like this tree or that tree, right? We're talking about something that is that unfortunately is political, right? I mean, we don't really want it to be. I don't see why it has to be, but it is. That's just the reality. And so, anytime you're dealing with a subject such as race and racism, it just is. So we're happy to kind of spearhead the conversation, and are really happy also to see other people picking up the torch as well, and moving, just moving the ball forward. And that's what, and I think, Dr. Bethard mentioned earlier, it is the long game. This is not going to happen overnight, right? We're not going to, see labs around the country changing their SOPs overnight. We're not going to see, certain professors, changing their practices, changing their research program that they've, this has been their research program for, a long time overnight. We're not, naive in that sense, but we are working the long game here. And both Dr. Bethard, Sean, as you mentioned, we're also privileged enough that we do train doctoral students. So I've already graduated one. I have another who will be graduating this spring, fingers crossed, in just a month or so, just over a month. That person will be defending their dissertation. And I'll have several others, just behind. And there are several other of our colleagues who do train doctoral students who, are of, a similar mindset as we are. And that's, and people as well who train, master students. And so, all of us kind of have to do our part, whether we're training, we only train undergraduates, or if we train masters or doctoral students. But those of us who do train doctoral students, I think, are in a special position, because we're training the people who will be training the future generations, right? Rather than just training people who are going to go become members of the public. Not that that's not important, because obviously that is super important, as we were talking about before, just the overall problem with science literacy. Or maybe we didn't talk about that here. I'm mixing up the
earlier podcast
today. So I'm mixing up between the previous one and this one. But if I didn't say it before, for this one, there is an enormous problem with science literacy in the United States. And so those of us who do only teach undergraduates have a special responsibility, right? Because they are really charged with helping to fix that problem of the very poor science literacy. But yeah, we're just, and we realize, sometimes it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Like that's the reality of how really any, not any, but that's the reality of how a lot of things sometimes can work. But like I said, this is the long game. This is important. This matters. And, this is something that both Dr. Bethard and I care about a lot. And, for those students who are listening, if you want to, engage with anthropology, if you want to engage with some other fields, whatever that may be, what is it that you care about, right? What's the hill you're going to die on? That you have to make you've got to decide. And for me, that this is, I have several hills. This is one of them. This, without question, this is one of them.
Well, I think it's very telling how much momentum has already picked up in such a short amount of time, especially, as you said, Dr. Bethard, in a field that is notorious for dragging its feet on things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I also think that, in some way, shape, or form, we agree, Dr. DiGangi and I agree that we wrote what we wrote. Yeah, we wrote it for our colleagues. We did, because we have perspective, obviously, but there's also something about writing literature that exists for graduate students now that didn't exist when we were there. So this is part of the conversation for Ancestry from here on out. It doesn't go away, right? And so I think about what the brilliant students who are coming after me, who are going to come to the field and think this, and then see what we've said about it and what the next step is going to be. So this is maybe foundational to pivoting the conversation, changing the paradigm in some way, shape, or form. And so sometimes you can't do it. You got to lay the foundation, and I think that's what this has been in a way. And I'm delighted to have been part of that. I hope we get some walls and a roof at some point. But I think that there are a lot of really smart, young, aspiring forensic anthropologists who now have this tool of the words that we've written that they can add to this story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was important to me as I was writing to not only speak to my colleagues, but to speak to undergraduates, right? I wanted to make, a lot of times in academia, our writing isn't necessarily accessible. It's written at a high level that can be difficult, maybe for undergraduates and even sometimes for other professors. I know I've certainly read some papers where I'm like, whoa, I'm a little bit lost. But we wanted to write it at a level where our colleagues would feel comfortable assigning it to Intro to Anthropology, right? So, even someone who's 18 years old, it's day one of college, they've got a high school diploma. Yes, so there's some technical terms, we define them all, some concepts that might be some sentences maybe that are a little bit harder to get through, but by and large, it's written in plain language. So, it's not written exclusively for people with a PhD. It's written for just a broader scientific public audience as well. And that was important to us to be able to get our message across. And that was part of the reason why we made it, we decided that it was important that both pieces be open access. So we obviously had to pay for that, and we had to pay a lot for that, but it was worth it because it means that all you have to do anywhere, whoever you are, it doesn't matter if you're affiliated with the university or not. You click on the link, boom, there it is. That's the beauty of open access. So the ideas can be dispersed, and we thought that this topic was important enough. We can't afford to publish every single paper we've ever written as open access. I would love to, can't afford to do that, but for something like this, you're strategic and you say, okay, this is important. So we've got to find a way to come up with the open access fees and make that happen.
Well,
Yeah,
I personally want to thank you for starting this conversation, making it open access, and allowing everybody to really contribute in the future based on a fire that you did light under this field.
Yeah, that's what I was just basically getting ready to say as well. I think Laura and I are absolutely in agreement. And I think as well, for a continuing student in this field, it mattered a lot for with these papers and you guys continuing this conversation and this push for change. Instead of having the door slammed in my face, it does exist. It's an opportunity and it can happen. And I appreciate that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're very welcome, and we're happy to, as Dr. Bethard said, to have been, the initial sort of torchbearers and demonstrate to students that doors can be opened, and that You can be brave and you can, use your voice. But we realized that the reality of the structure in academia, as a graduate student, it would be challenging to write a piece like this. And it even would be challenging to get to the point intellectually where you had developed your, just your intellectual development in terms of all the things that you've read and so forth, that you've gotten to a point where you can, synthesize the literature in a way that we were able to do, based on, our 20 years or so of experience, including from when we started graduate school. But to demonstrate that, yeah, you do get to a point in your intellectual development and in your academic career where it's okay, where you think to yourself, you know what, I have something to say and I'm going to go ahead and say it. And it's okay if other people don't like it. It's okay if it's provocative, right? And in fact, maybe it's my responsibility, depending on what I'm passionate about, to be provocative and to say, wait a minute, I'm not okay with this anymore. Maybe I was before, but I've grown as a scholar. I've developed as a scholar. I've developed and grown as a person. This isn't okay. This is why. I'm going to explain it to you. And if you don't like what I have to say, okay, right? But there are going to be a lot of people who are going to like it and who are going to be inspired by it and who are going to write their master's theses and their dissertations and move that ball down the field. So that's the goal.
Yeah, and I'll just conclude by saying really quickly, I'd like to thank you both and the CEA for the opportunity to speak and this platform. So it's really an honor to be able to have this dialogue and for us to dialogue a little bit more in the future. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. This has really been great. And to everybody who's listening, thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. I know, we do so much Zoom that it can be hard to sit in front of even more Zooms. So thank you for taking the time to listen and to, think about engaging with some of these issues.
Thank you so much to both of you for being willing to talk and for sitting down and talking. We really do appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Sean.